If you like the show Dangerous Minds and Mindhunter, you'll love today's video because today we're going to be discussing active killers, hostage negotiation, and at the end of our video today, domestic violence and how to escape a dangerous situation where you're being held captive. I'm Lisa Taylor Austin, licensed psychotherapist and expert witness. And my esteemed guest today is Dr. Gregory Vecchi, former chief of the Behavioral Science Unit of the FBI. And I have to refer to my notes here because Dr. Vecchi has a very extensive resume. He is also the director of training at Safe Defend. He's a certified master trainer in threat evaluation and reporting with the U.S. Department of Homeland Security. He is the author of a book named Fatal Grievances. This is the most recent book here. And he has authored many books, professional articles, and book chapters. He's a specialist in crisis and hostage negotiation, suicide intervention, crisis management, and targeted violence. Dr. Vecchi is also a professor of criminal justice at Kaiser University. And I had the distinct honor of being trained by him to become a certified behavioral analyst. And I have a great amount of respect for Dr. Vecchi, and I know we'll be learning a lot from him today. So Dr. Vecchi, thank you so much for joining us.
Well, it's my pleasure, Lisa. Thanks for having me on. Been anxiously waiting for this interview. I'm very excited.
Oh, good, good, good. I know that many people watching are going to be interested to hear a little bit first about your work with the FBI and what you did there and that type of thing. Can you share with us a little about that?
Yeah, I guess I'll focus on, I think, what your most interest is, because, as an FBI agent, we all go through the academy, we all get, the training, we all have to do criminal investigations and things like this. What was kind of interesting with me with the FBI and how I kind of got into the hostage negotiation and the behavioral science and analysis aspect, that specialty area in the Bureau, basically came from my time working Russian organized crime as a new agent. And so as a new agent, I went to Miami. I had a lot of law enforcement experience prior to that, but nothing where I worked at that level and working organized crime and things like this. And so I was put on a Russian organized crime task force, and those type of investigations, like the mafia, right? The Italian mafia, anytime there's organized crime, the problem you run into with these cases in terms of prosecution and investigation is the fact that the people who are in charge, the people that are giving the orders to kill or to, assassinate or to, beat somebody up for money or steal or rob, whatever it is like this, these guys don't actually do it. They order someone else, another person does it. And so without what we have in place, right, like the RICO, the continuing criminal enterprise, the conspiracy laws and things like this, what it allows you to do is prosecute everyone involved in that line of communication or that line of authority, right? So if you imagine you got a crime boss and he tells his underling, go assassinate, go whack this guy, right? And, steal his money. Okay. And then the guy goes and kills the person. Okay. Without conspiracy laws, you could charge obviously the person who committed the crime, but you couldn't go after the guy who gave the order. And that has been the perennial issue prior to these laws being put into place. Right. And so what's kind of interesting on this is that the only way you can really get that is to capture the communication apparatus. So what does that mean in terms of practicality? It means wiretaps. It means bugging rooms. It means undercover operations where you have a person posing as a bad guy wearing some sort of a wire recorder. Anything that's going to capture the actual verbal, okay, go do this, right? Go kill this person, go steal his money. And so that was a type of, cases that we worked in the FBI, specifically what I worked on, both in the Russian organized crime area, general organized crime, and even on the DEA task force. We were going after, these importers of drugs and stuff like that, right? So needless to say, the Russian guys were pretty bad guys. At this time, and I'm dating myself, right, as far as age, right? This is in the 90s, right? And when I was working on this. And so the Russian criminals of that era were former KGB guys. They were former prisoners. And so they would come in, to the United States, and they would take over all of the rackets, the human trafficking, the drug trafficking, everything you can think of, they would get into. They would strong arm the competition, kill them, and just take over that racket. And that was the problem we were trying to address. And so part of that process is, of course, listening, on their telephone and things like this. So as a fairly new agent, it comes time to do the arrest, right? So I've been on these wiretaps, listening to these guys, 24 hours a day for 2 years, right? And then it comes time to arrest them. And of course, knowing that these are killers, they're bad guys, we have the SWAT guys come in, right? The tactical guys to come in, because that's what they do, right? So as you might have seen on TV, right? You've got, the FBI van, dark van that comes up and doesn't say FBI on it, but y'all know it's FBI, right? And door opens up, and you got these really in shape guys, that have got all their guns and their armor and stuff like this, and they come in. Well, those are your SWAT guys. So we got to brief these guys. So they come in maybe a day or two before the arrest. And it's my job as a case agent to say, okay, well, here's what we got here. And you lay out pictures and information about what they did and all the other stuff, so they can come up with a good arrest plan, so they can safely arrest a person without as less damage as possible of people getting hurt, especially themselves and us. And so it was kind of interesting. And what launched me on this whole thing was this very case, because when these SWAT guys came in for their briefing, I got this room full of young guys, very buff, like I said, everything like this. And then in the back in the corner, there was this guy who was kind of shorter than everybody else. He was fatter than everybody else. He was older than everybody else, and he was balder than everybody else, right? And so I do the briefing. Okay, I noticed the guy, but I don't see anything, right? Okay, and then everybody leaves except for the guy, and he's sitting there. He's just sitting in the back, and he goes, and he walks up to me. He says, and he sits down. He goes, "Tell me about your guy." And I'm thinking, dude, I just did. Right. I mean, I just laid out everything. And he says, no. I don't mean about his criminal activity and stuff that's needed for the arrest. I want you to tell me about him. Tell me about his background. Tell me about, his family. Does he have kids? What's important to him? What are his values? What pisses him off? Various things like this. And so I'm like, I had no idea what he was getting at, but I said, okay, whatever. So I gave him the information. The last thing he asked me for was his telephone number, and I gave it to him, and the guy leaves. So fast forward to the arrest, right? So now this is very early in the morning. Imagine you've seen this on TV. All the SWAT guys are all dressed in black. They're all stacked up, and they got their shield. They're going to kick in the door, and and right now, at this point, I'm thinking this could really go bad, because these are Russians, right? These are violent guys. I had every expectation they were going to put up a fight. But before the door could even be kicked in, he came out on his own with his hands up and just surrendered with no problem. And
Wow.
I'm like, what? What the heck? What was that? Well, as I found out, that guy who I thought was kind of a reject was actually the hostage negotiator. And what he did for me, that in that case was magic to me. I said, I wanted to be like this guy, right? I wanted to do what he does. I want to learn this. And that is what started my whole negotiation, behavioral analysis, behavioral science, and my focus of where I've landed today through my career at the FBI and whatever. Because negotiation, right? It's one of those things where you're influencing and persuading an offender right in the middle of the crime, right while he's committing the crime. As a law enforcement officer, I'm engaging him, and I'm basically influencing him to not do anything, to actually come out. In about 90% of the cases, they do, simply because I asked them to. So so that whole negotiation piece that people know me for, that's what drove that. And that's what, the results is why does that work? Right. And so, I wanted to get better at it. Right. So, I, got fairly good at it, got a lot of training and everything like this, but I still couldn't answer why did it work? Why does this work? And so that led me to my PhD in conflict resolution. I looked at psychology, I looked at, some other social science type degrees and things like this, and it didn't really answer why it worked, but conflict resolution did, right? So then all my trainings and my books and articles and things and my practice is based on that understanding. And so I basically maintained that negotiation position throughout my time in the FBI for a couple of years or 1 year. I was full-time negotiator in crisis negotiation, and that gave me some access in international kidnapping, right? And hostage taking, much different. And I saw some of your questions you want to ask me. I'll detail those later, knowing the difference and get some information on that. And then I had the opportunity then to go in the FBI's behavioral science unit. And so I went in there, and my focus, because I had a kidnapping, hostage taking, barricaded situation, negotiation background, my emphasis was understanding those offenders, right? And so then the question is, well, what do you do in the FBI's behavioral science unit, right? Well, I was there as an agent, as an analyst, as a whatever you want to call it, assessor, whatever you want to call it. Um, uh, but and then became the chief later on. I was lucky enough to be put in charge of it. And so we're known for behavioral science units and known for the profiling. It's known for the serial killers and things like this. And that is very unique to them, right? It's unique to that unit. But it also applies to other offenders, right? And so while I was in there, I focused on kidnappers, hostage takers, as far as that being my focus of study, research, consultations, investigations, was on those folks, going into prisons and talking to those people, trying to figure out why they do what they do. We had other people talking to cop killers and cyber hackers and active shooters and active killers and all these other things, right? And then that information, and what makes it unique is an understanding of that offender from their perspective, and using that understanding and then tying that in with, human behavior, known human behavior, and the specific offense, right? To provide value in helping law enforcement, better investigate, better interrogate, better interview, better be able to deal with that type of offender. Because these offenders, although they're all criminals, okay, they may be all criminals, but they're not the same, even in terms of types of violence, which again, I know you're going to ask me about later. And so that whole thing, is how I got, to that point into the FBI. I retired in 2014 and still continue to do that, just in the private sector.
I think for a lot of people listening, that sounds pretty exciting. Um, did it feel that way to you?
Oh yeah, I totally loved it. It was just kind of like, if I were going to tell you my, the time I'm having the best time is when I'm doing a negotiation in the middle of a
Mhm.
crime, in the middle of a barricade situation, when there's been lots of violence and potential violence there, and you're able to connect with that person and actually convince them and persuade them to put the gun down and come out, and to do that because I asked them to. And it's really just a different kind of behavioral science or behavioral analysis. When you look at behavioral analysis and you look at, the different things you can do with it, this is just a verbal or a communication aspect of behavioral analysis versus the more nonverbal stuff you think of when you're thinking of serial killers and crime scenes and things like that.
I never had the opportunity to watch you do it, but I know you're very good at it because when I talk to you, I can kind of hear it in your voice. I think it's just part of who you are. Not that you're, trying to negotiate me out of any dangerous situation, but I can hear it in your voice that I know that you are just really, really, really very skilled at that. And
Well, I
still
love it.
are, still
Yeah, I
are.
don't, I'm still, but here's the deal. I still don't feel I know as much as I need to know. It's just, I mean, you just never stop learning. It's like any other expert, I think, if you sit back and say, oh yeah, I know everything there is to know, that's probably time to just leave, right? Just retire and go off pasture, right?
I want to shift the topic a little. In your book, you talk about the differences between expressive violence, instrumental violence, and grievance violence. And I know this is pretty complex, but I'm wondering if you could kind of summarize that for people watching.
Sure. Well, expressive is another term for emotional violence. A lot of times it's without thought, without premeditation, essentially. It's like reactive violence. That would be expressive type violence. Um, when you're talking about instrumental violence, that is something where there is some sort of planning or premeditation that's involved, right? So it's kind of like the difference if you're thinking of a cat, right? You got a cat, right? Your house cat, and you all of a sudden, do this, right? And then goes, and they start scratching and all the other stuff. That is reactive expressive violence.
Mhm.
Okay, as an example. You have that same cat that is after the mouse, that's instrumental violence. Okay. And when you're talking about grievance violence, now we're getting into the active killer type person, right? It's its own unique type of offender. And the grievance violence is associated with these so-called active killers, these types of people. It's predatory, but it's based on uh, their grievance of feelings of being wronged, feelings of being persecuted, feelings of maybe significant loss in their life, or even ideology like terrorism.
So a lot of these active, what we used to call active shooters, which you're now calling active killers, fall into that category, the ones that we've, hear about in the news. How has that changed at all over the years, or has it?
You know, it's gotten I think it's gotten more prevalent over the years. If you look at the stats, it's still rather rare.
Mhm.
I think in 2023 stats aren't out, but 2022 stats, which is the FBI and Secret Service, right? They've got the most accurate stats based on what they're actually measuring. So first off, when you're looking at, is it increasing, decreasing? When someone says a number, oh, there's been 703 of them, in this year so far. Well, you got to really look at it because again, it's a very specific form of offender, a very specific form of violence. It's not people who are involved in domestic violence, for example. It excludes that. It excludes gang violence. Okay. It excludes suicide. It excludes negligent discharges or just firing a gun, right? Um, the the weakness of that definition is the fact that it also excludes anything but guns, right? So when you look at active shooter statistics, which is you can't really get active killer statistics. No one tracks them. An active killer statistic is just the same type of violence, grievance violence, um, done against someone that ended in their death, right? Or a casualty, right? And so it could be you're beating them up with your hands. It could be a knife. It could be a bomb. It could be a gun, right? It's all the same because it's just a different tool. The problem is that we only track, or the FBI only tracks because that's all they have the ability to do is track active shooters. So you're limiting yourself. For example, if you're talking about school violence, about 60% of the kids in K through 12 that engage in this type of violence, 60% use guns, 40% don't. They use knives, right? So you got to realize that that's a limitation, but you have to just understand that. So if you're looking at a statistic and you're looking at numbers, like you're asking, has it changed over the years? Well, you have to look also is, well, are we comparing apples to apples? And so when you're comparing apples to apples on this, so to speak, it's going to be, you know, premeditated grievance-based violence. Okay. And it's going to be that's done with a gun. So when you're looking at that, there has been an increase of that over time. Not a whole lot if you really look at it. And I don't mean to make light of it in any way, but the numbers is 2022, there are 50. In the entire United States, there are only 50 that qualify as true active shooters that relate specifically to that type of violence and that type of offender. And that's across all venues, open air, public, business, K through 12, universities, churches. There's a list of them, right? All those environments. So there are only 50. Okay. Now, is there been an increase? There's been a fairly steady increase. So the question is why? Well, a lot of it has to do with the 24-hour news cycle, this focus on the offender, and social media. Okay. And also, I think just a lack of family support, lack of a nuclear family, not having a dad, not having, all the stuff that has changed radically over the last 50 years.
Have you found that active killers have more mental illness? Or have you found that some of these active killers don't have any real mental illness at all?
It's a mixed bag.
Mhm.
I mean, if you look at any statistic, I think the statistic I've seen as far as that goes is about the worst I've seen, put it this way, the worst I've seen statistically, just generally across all active killers, is about maybe 60% have got some sort of mood disorder, mental illness, personality disorder, whatever it is, which means that 40% don't. And to use the mental illness as a metric for this is false. Mental illness is not correlated to this at all. Okay. In terms of threat assessment and looking and determining a threat level and whether or not this person is truly a threat or not. And now the question is, okay, is it important? Of course it's important. What mental illness will do is I consider it a threat enhancer or an indirect behavior. So you have to to answer that question, you kind of have to step back and say, okay, well, what happens or what are the stages or the steps that an active killer goes through? Okay. Well, first off, they have to be on this plan lethal violence track or this pathway to violence. It's basically, you can label it what you want. Pathway to violence is probably the most common one out there. The pathway to violence for these offenders means that there's a grievance or crisis that happens in their lives that exceeds their ability to cope with the situation. And for whatever reason, maybe they've tried, maybe they haven't, but they believe from their perspective that they can't deal with it and no one's there to help them. The problem is, as you know, as a clinician, right, if a crisis is not dealt with, it only gets worse. Okay. And it's no different with these people. And so if you have someone who's in crisis and it's not dealt with, then the next stage is violent ideation or intent. And that's when they decide that, look, I've tried everything. I still can't take it. No one's helping me. Violence becomes the answer. And then there's a decision made to be violent against the person who's causing the grievance. Okay. Again, it's driven by the crisis, right? So if the crisis isn't dealt with and that person isn't dealt with, then they'll move on to the third stage, which is research and planning. And they're going to go in and look at previous attacks. If you're K through 12, you'll find on their internet search that the Columbine is probably the most researched how-to video. If you're a university shooter, you're probably going to go to Cho on the Virginia Tech shooting, right? But they'll look at previous attackers. They'll look at previous legacy tokens, things that previous attackers have left behind, like manifestos or just reasons why they did it. It could be video, it could be photos, it could be, things written down. They're going to research what guns, what can I get, right? Can I get a gun? If I can't get a gun, what else could I get? And, that kind of ties into the other problem when you're focusing on mental illness as a reason for this, right? Guns aren't either. Guns are just, they're enhancers, but they're not the reason, right? And so, but getting back to the pathway, you got your grievance and fatal grievance and crisis. You got your violent ideation and intent. You got your research and planning. The crisis isn't dealt with after that. Then they're going to go for preparation and optimization. What that means is they get the guns or the knives, whatever they're going to use. They get the maps of the school. They create kill lists and hit lists and whatever else. They get the schedule of their target. When are they there? What's their office? Where are they located? Where do they park outside? And then they'll maybe do dry runs to test things, right? Know where the cameras are, things like that. And then again, if the crisis is dealt with, then we have the transition to the breaching and the attacking. And at that point, we're in a response mode. It's no longer a prevention thing. So you first have to understand that to understand these offenders, you have to first understand that these are grievance predators, and these grievance predators go through those steps every single time. Now, the context changes a little bit, certainly. The methods might change a little bit, but regardless if it's a kid or an elderly person, and we've seen the whole gamut, they're going to go through these same stages. Now, when you're talking about mental illness, okay, that is not one of those stages, but it can be a threat enhancer. And here's how it could work. So let's say someone had some aspect of psychosis. Okay, they're suffering from delusions or hallucinations, for example. Okay, and you have to realize that this type of is a grievance predator, so it's a grievance. So they go to school, they go to work. It's a workplace. They go to work, and they think that this person is after them. And they think that person works for the CIA, and they think that that person is planning to assassinate them. Well, if you understand delusions and hallucinations, they are real things to those people experiencing them, right? You can't talk them out of it. So that is their reality. But here's the deal. It's still a grievance and becomes a fatal grievance. And that's the difference, right? Is that it's a perception or a filtering problem that mental illness has on these killers, not that it's a reason. And then I'll take it a step further. We talked about guns, right? Taking guns away is not going to change their desire to kill. It's going to enhance their ability to kill, certainly. I mean, just as you well know, I mean, if I were going to advise someone on how to kill someone, I would first and foremost say get a rifle with lots of mags and go to the range and learn how to use it. You're certainly going to do more damage with that than you will with a knife, or if you're trying to run someone over in the parking lot. But here's the problem with threat assessment. If you're planning for the gun, you're going to miss the knife. Okay. You're going to miss the person who's going to run somebody over in a parking lot. You're going to miss that evidence, right? Or those indicators, right? And so you want to step back and look at it, kind of holistically from the standpoint, is the person actually on the pathway? And if they are, where are they? And wherever they are dictates what you do next in terms of the escalation, what you want to call it, threat level 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, whatever you want to call it, or you want to call it low, moderate, high, imminent, whatever you want to call it. And then what does that mean in terms of your interventions, right? Because what happens is that your golden hour or your golden time to stop this or prevent it on this pathway is the first two. It's the grievance crisis, violent ideation stage. If you let it go to research and planning and preparation, the time compresses and it's much harder to convince that person not to commit violence.
It's so interesting to hear about the mental illness piece, because I think society in general hears about these types of killings on the news and automatically thinks to themselves, well, this person must be mentally ill and have some type of a diagnosis.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, everybody's trying to diagnose. It's not about diagnosing anything. It's about looking at the behavior.
Thank you for that. That's I think a really important thing for people to know.
Thank you. Yep.
Um, I want to kind of shift gears here to domestic violence because that's different than what you were just talking about. So we hear about and see about on the news people who maybe take their own family hostage, kill all of them, and not always, but sometimes kill themselves. Um, Kind of what's the psychology behind that?
Well,
And that involve mental illness, or do you think that involves more of rage or control or something like of that nature?
again, here's the deal. Typically, people who are mentally ill are not violent. Most are not. It's just a fact. Some are, obviously. And, if they have multiple problems going on, and then starting into personality disorders and things like that, like antisocial and narcissism and some of these other ones that I know you're going to touch on later in the interview, certainly that adds potential, danger and things like this. But it's still just, kind of understanding, what's driving it. Okay. It could be grievance. A lot of times it's just power and control. And the power and control we see a lot in domestic violence. It's like, you're mine, you can't be anyone else's, right? And tied to that is a lot of times low self-esteem. A lot of the times that is narcissism or antisocial personality disorder. Sometimes it's just manipulative. Usually it's basically very self-centered behavior, and its violence is used to have power control over somebody else for whatever reason. It might be a grievance. It might just be because they just like to control people. They like to control their wife, their girlfriend, and it works both ways. Women can be domestic violently against their male partners, and it doesn't really matter. It exists on both sides. Um, I think the other thing is that as the victim of domestic violence, you're isolated, right? And when you're isolated, then you're more easily influenced. And when you're isolated, you fall prey to that, the battered women syndrome, right? Which is a real thing, right? It's like he treats me like crap. And then when it gets so bad, I'm ready to leave him. He gets flowers and he's really nice. And then we go down that road again. And it builds almost this very unhealthy psychological dependence on them, right? And that's what you have to break when you're doing, counseling with these people, you're talking to thes people, is to realize that you got power, you got much more power and control than you think you do. But what happens is anyone who's isolated and who's been, treated in the manner that they're treated, and controlling, guy's bigger, he's more powerful, he's manipulative, he plays games, he gaslights you. He denies when he does something wrong, and gets angry because you point things out. It's very selfish, it's very controlling. It's just power and control mixed in with some grievance, and then isolating that person, and then establishing dominance and control through this perception of dependency, which is a perception. It's not even real. But then they realize that they don't work, and they all this other stuff, right? So now he's got the money, and he's got and all these other things, and what it does is just beats him down. And it's an awful, terrible place to be. And sometimes when you add drug abuse, alcohol abuse, you add personality disorders to that, it can rise to the level of an actual hostage type taking, right? Barricaded situation. That's basically a homicide to be. And then you get your, where the victim very well may be killed, and another guy may or may not take his life. Often they do.
Sometimes we see the Stockholm syndrome where the abused person actually has empathy for the abuser. And, you talked about that cycle, which is very common in narcissism, where, narcissists love bomb and then devalue and then ultimately discard. And what many people don't know is you can be discarded even if you're living with the narcissist and they continue to live with you. And then they start that cycle all over again. Do you have any thoughts? I think oftentimes people confuse narcissism and antisocial personality disorder. And they look the same, but their motivation is different. Do you have any thoughts about, I don't know really what I want to ask about that, but maybe
Yeah.
do you have thoughts about like the difference between those two?
Yeah. Here's the deal. In my world, in terms of law enforcement, in terms of gaining compliance in person, self-preservation, you know, uh, how to deal with these people, how to give advice on people that are in these situations, stuff like this. We look at it from the standpoint of operational psychology versus clinical psychology. First of all, there's a difference. Okay. Clinical psychology, the purpose is to help that person who is the problem, right? The narcissist, the antisocial personality guy, the person who is psychotic or has schizophrenia or whatever else like this. And so you go to that old DSM-5 manual, right? And you look it up, right? You look up the features, right? Or you look up the characteristics. And as you said, they're very similar, but they're different. Um, the focus for me is not so much on the diagnosis. It doesn't really matter what the diagnosis is, but you use the diagnostic criteria to help your negotiation. Okay. And that's the difference. So for a clinical psychologist, a counselor, a social worker, whoever it is, their use of the diagnosis is to provide a diagnosis, a prognosis, and then manage that person, right? Okay. And so it's about intervening with that person to help them be less of a problem, right? Essentially, right? Okay, and try to manage their situation, use drugs if necessary, whatever. The operational psychology approach is much different, and it's more geared toward identifying, assessing, and engaging the problem, or the person who has maybe this diagnosis, right? So we never from the standpoint say, oh, I'm dealing with an antisocial personality disorder, or I'm dealing with we never do any sort of diagnosis. Diagnosis doesn't matter. It's what's going on in the moment, right? How do you negotiate? How do you communicate with that person? How do you teach somebody else who's living with a person like that how to deal with that person, right? Using, the negotiation, and the anti-manipulation strategies and things like that, right? Um, the thing you have to realize that the biggest distinction, in my opinion, I mean, they look very much the same. They're both very self-centered. Their favorite words are I, me, and my. Okay. And they don't have a lot of remorse in terms of hurting people. They don't really feel bad about it. That's kind of common between. I would probably say that the thing that's makes the antisocial personality disorder, the psychopath, the sociopath, whatever you want to call them, makes them much worse than a narcissist is the fact that they are typically more aggressive, okay, and they are they react very quickly. They don't think about it, right? They're impulsive. So I would say the impulsivity and the aggression is really the signaling point, and also the point that makes them much dangerous. So if I'm dealing with someone who is difficult now, now anyone can be dangerous, certainly, but the narcissist is very difficult to deal. He's a jerk. He's manipulative. He's going to try to control you, and but the basis is that he's got a problem deep inside. He doesn't like to be told anything that's going to be critical of him and things like this. And the antisocial personality disorder is probably very similar. The difference is that he'll become very impulsive and be quicker to violence more often than you see in the narcissist. But they look almost identically the same. And I would be looking at, as far as looking at threat level and as far as looking at dangerousness, indicators of aggressiveness and actual threats. Either that's a direct threat, an indirect threat, a veiled threat, conditional threat, various threats like this, because that's where the real danger is. There's psychological trauma. Certainly with a narcissist, narcissists can be violent, okay? But the antisocial personality disorder is kind of like its own unique animal. A psychopath, which is the worst part of that, right? The real extreme guy, right? Um, I think maybe 2 to 3% of the population is actually diagnosable as that. Yet they're responsible for more than 40% of the cop killings, for example. They're drawn to gangs, right? You're going to have a higher percentage in gangs. You'll have a higher percentage in the prison population, right? Of those types of people. And so, it's kind of one of those things for me. I mean, from a counselor or diagnosis perspective, I think it's important to really be able to to understand the difference because the treatment is going to be obviously different, right? It's going to be a different approach. But the deal is you're trying to help them with their problem. I don't care about their problem when I'm negotiating with them. I'm caring about my safety or teaching someone else for their safety and what to look for in terms of the behaviors. And when you start looking at someone who is impulsive and is aggressive, those are the indicators we're looking at to deal with. Rather, that's de-escalation and doing it from a more of a tactical negotiation perspective, where you act like you're learning from them and they're a big deal, and you give them compliments, you stroke their ego, right? And you get out based on that, or physical things that at some point pre-attack behaviors and things like this that are going to require more of a physical thing, like getting out of there, or going and calling the police, or whatever it amounts to. So yeah, I would say that they're two different disorders. Obviously, they're not the same disorder. I would say though, from experience, the psychopath or the antisocial personality disorder or the kid with conduct disorder, whatever you want to call it, right? It's all the same. Um, in terms of the behavior, is much more dangerous from the standpoint of aggressiveness and impulsivity.
Yeah, I definitely agree. I'm in a few online forums where people are talking about narcissism, and I think that many people don't see the early warning signs. It's like all of a sudden when the narcissist gets into a narcissistic rage or becomes verbally um, or even physically more threatening, then it's like, oh, I'm in a bad situation. Um, so, what would you give as advice to people who might be in these situations in terms of what do they need to be looking for earlier?
Well, I think it's, like you had said, I mean, you just said it perfectly. I think one of the things that we do is we make excuses for people, and we have to have clear boundaries and a clear threshold that when you sense um, someone trying to be aggressive or being more passive aggressive kind of or whatever, that you either call them on it or you deal with it sooner than letting it go, because they like to play the game, both of them. Okay. They will always, they're like kids. They want to see what they can get away with. And the more you let them get away with, then the more aggressive and the more dangerous they become. And I think that, one of the best advices I could give to someone is trust your spidey sense, right? Okay. You may not be able to explain exactly that it's a threat. You may not understand, implicit or indirect threats or veiled threats, and all that, because that's very technical, but it sounds or feels like a threat. Here's the deal. If you sense any threat to your physical, emotional, or psychological well-being. And your body will tell you that. Your body knows that before you know it. Okay. This goes back to the caveman days when we used to be on the menu, right? Okay. And if you're on the menu, just like the deer, you see deer all the time. Perfect example. They are heightened sense, and they are going to react, and they react based on their instinct. Well, we have that instinct too, but we oftentimes try to justify, oh, it couldn't have been that. We see this with the active shooters, active killers also. You hear a gunshot, they don't believe it's a gunshot. Oh, that couldn't be a gunshot. Oh, maybe I'm sure it's a firecracker. Oh, it's nothing. right? You dismiss it. That's human nature. And I think that happens, when you're in domestic violence situations, because typically it's a relationship where you, at least on some level, or at least at the beginning, you guys were friends, maybe you're lovers, maybe, you love the person. And if you love the person and he's manipulating you and kind of sucking you in slowly day by day, you don't really even realize it, right? Those emotional predators, right? Happens all the time, right? But you look at things like, are they trying to isolate you? Are they, do they really share my values? Are they saying stuff that goes against, what your values are, or what you believe, or what you hope for in the relationship? And oftentimes it's because they are fear of losing that person. And again, it falls into that, almost like that syndrome, right? Where they feel isolated, and then it's like, well, I have to make this work. Well, the thing is, you don't have to make this work, and I think that probably the best advice is listen to your senses. When you sense something, call them out on it. And if you can't call them out on it, then get out of there before it becomes dangerous. Get help. Get someone to talk to, someone to be your advocate. Get out of that situation, because that's a loop and a cycle. It's a power control cycle that they love. It's a game, and they want you to stay with them because they want to continue to play the game, and that's not love. I don't care how much you love them. That's not love, and that's not a relationship. And I just think that people don't react quickly enough to it. They don't listen to their own feelings, their own that like I said, that spidey sense of, this there's something wrong here. Well, don't ignore that something wrong. Look at it, and there's nothing wrong with just separating and getting out from that isolation, and then reestablishing later, or just reassessing what's going on.
I agree with you 100%. There's a lot of brainwashing that happens too,
Oh,
especially
yeah,
with,
gaslighting too. Gaslighting is huge. It's a huge technique that they use. And then when they're doing the same thing, right? They're doing stuff that's bad, then they deny everything. They say nothing, deny everything, and make counter accusations, right? That's typical, spycraft stuff, and they use that all the time. And then they gaslight you, meaning that they're trying to make you to believe a situation, or making you think that's, that with the situation that you believe to be true isn't. It must be something else, right? And you need to believe, that's a huge piece. So I would, even as counselors and as just reading material, understand, gaslighting, understand the behaviors of these people. They can become very predatory. I mean, it's always manipulative, but you want to just be able to get out of it before it becomes aggressive, and before you get trapped.
yeah. I always tend to think of people living in a situation like that are more in danger than just the average citizen going to a movie theater, because the abuser has access to them 24/7 because they're living in
Absolutely.
the same home, right?
Yeah. Oh, 100%. Yeah. I think that's much more dangerous than your likelihood or probability of being attacked in the movie theater. Absolutely.
Mhm,
100%.
mhm. So we like to always advise people in those types of situations, don't inform the abuser that you're going to leave. Make a plan kind of in secret.
Mhm.
Make sure that you have your support networks in place, have everything planned out, have copies of all your important documents, things of that nature, and then decide when you're going to do it, and do it and do a clean break. So you're shaking your head. You're in
Um,
agreement with that?
oh, 100%. That's a great strategy. That is
So
fantastic.
tell us, if we're ever a hostage in any kind of situation, what should we be doing
Well,
to,
yeah, it really, well, okay. So if someone, are you talking about if someone actually gets taken hostage, what do they do?
yeah, either in their home or at a movie theater, um, anywhere?
Well, I mean, there again, it's different situations, right? The term hostage has a very specific meaning, versus a victim, right? And I know people think, what are you talking about? A hostage and a victim, meaning, let's say, a kidnapping or a prison takeover, or the guy who comes home and finds out that his wife's been cheating on him and now takes her against her will. They're all captives, right? And so from a negotiation perspective, right, the way we look at it, right, is that you're dealing with who are the players? Who are the players that are going to be communicating, right? Okay, so in a hostage situation, it's considered a triadic relationship. Okay, it means you have your hostage taker, or hostage takers, right? Your hostage or hostages, and the third person they need to get what they want. Now, in a kidnapping situation, it could be the family member because they want ransom. In a prison takeover, it could be the warden or the governor or whoever that could provide them more privileges, right? Um, but in a barricaded situation, right, which is a victim type relationship, it's a dyadic relationship between the captive taker, the person taking that person against their will, and that victim. And there is no third person, and they don't want a third person because it's between them two. So in the former, a hostage situation is instrumental. It's instrumental violence. They're using the person as leverage. Okay. In a barricaded situation, there's no leverage. Their beef or their problem is with that person. And by virtue, that situation is much more dangerous in terms of the person being held captive than the hostage situation because there's value. And that dictates then how do you talk to them. And then the structure is a little bit different, right? So if you look at a kidnapping and a hostage situation, it's still a three-way conversation between the hostage taker, the hostage, and the third person they need something from because it's leverage. It's a business deal. That's instrumental violence. It's a negotiation. It's business. And as long as the hostage taker gets something of value for the hostage will be let go, right? It's a very simple calculus, right? So that dictates then how you talk to them. So it's a cost benefit thing, and it's basically it's like a business deal. It's instrumental. It's tactical negotiation. It's bargaining. It's whatever, and that's one side. The other side, which is what most people know when they think of hostage taking, is that domestic violence situation. Okay, guy thinks his wife's cheating on him, so he grabs her, puts a gun to her head, barricades themselves in his house. Right? It's emotional. It's expressive violence. It's between him and her. He doesn't want anyone else. There's no third party that he wants there, especially the police, right? And it's more likely if things don't happen, it's gonna result in the injury or death of that hostage or that person being held captive, and likely or sometimes likely, I mean, a high percentage of the time, suicide also, right? And that then dictates how you talk to that person because when I arrive at a situation in a barricaded situation as a hostage negotiator or a crisis negotiator, I know that I'm not wanted. So I have a whole litany of stuff I got to do to get permission to talk to that person and then let alone build that relationship and then getting that person to release his wife and come out without any further violence. And, and it's more of a crisis intervention, suicide intervention or prevention approach in terms of how I talk to them. And so in those situations, since it's emotional, it's expressive, I'm not on part of the conversation. They don't want me there. I got to be the helper. I got to come in and deal with the emotions. I got to deal with that person and what they're thinking. And so I become the helper. I become the social support because almost every one of those people, regardless of their background, I mean, they could be doing terrible things. They could have killed somebody already. They could have raped somebody already. Now they've got the person, they're shot 5 people. Now they got this other person held up. I'm going to approach them in the same manner. Rather it's a domestic violence situation or bank robber or a terrorist or a child molester, I'm going to approach them the same way. And my opening line is always, when I was in the FBI is, hi, I'm Greg with the FBI. Are you okay? That's my opening line. And that starts, and I establish that I'm here to help type stuff. Because really, at the end of the day, the person comes out because I ask him to, right? And the reason he does is because I'm the only person that's making sense and seems to really care about that person in the moment, even though he knows I'm a police officer or law enforcement officer, and he knows that his life is going to change probably forever after this interaction, right? Yet it still works. And that's the magic of it, right? That's it's a form of behavioral analysis. It's just a verbal influence persuasion type stuff. And so when you're talking about, hostages versus, victims and things like this, you have to understand the relationships, the motivation of why they're doing it. Is it expressive? Is it instrumental? And be able to explain that, and then look at the structure, because that all dictates what else is going on. Because we got police, we got the SWAT people, we got investigators out there, we got on-scene commanders, we got evidence people, we got emergency services, and you got to coordinate all of that. But I'm the only one talking to the bad guy, or to the person in crisis, whatever it is. And and then it's kind of interesting, because when you look at hostage negotiation and you look at why does it work, the reason it works is because how you define what a crisis is. Okay, the crisis is, two things have to exist for a crisis to exist. Number one, they have to be beyond their ability to cope. Number two, they have to believe that there's no one to turn to help. And as long as those two exist, those two conditions exist, that person is in crisis. Okay. Now, in a barricaded situation, guy loses his job. He comes home. His wife is going to leave him, and then he takes her hostage against her will. Right. Okay. That's a very acute, fast thing that happened in the last probably 24 hours. Right. That person's in crisis. And so I go in as the negotiator. And remember, crisis exists if you can't cope and you don't have anybody there to help you. Guess what I become? I become their helper, right? And as soon as I give them an option or another way to look at it, I reframe the situation, and I get to a situation to where I am now their social support. And I establish that from the minute I open my mouth and say, "Hi, I'm Gregory, the FBI. Are you okay?" And I stick, no matter how much they hang up on me, or how much they scream at me and hate me and yell at me and threaten me and all the other stuff, I still maintain the helper. And over time, okay, they realize that, oh, this is not such a great idea. He's giving me an option. It's a fair option. What I thought I was going to do isn't going to work. I don't want to get in any more trouble. And then they end up coming out because I have stopped their crisis by becoming their social support. Okay. Now let's move that same thing over to the active killer. Okay. Almost all the active killers, rather they're bullied, feel they're persecuted, bullied, wronged, ideology, big loss in their life, whatever it is, they're in crisis. And that crisis has the same definition as a hostage negotiation barricaded situation. Okay. They can't cope with the situation and no one's there to help. The difference between that type of a crisis situation and the one you're going to find in a barricaded situation, like with domestic violence, is that the domestic violence one is more acute and it's happened in a very short period of time. The active killer situation is a crisis or a grievance that's much more chronic, and the steps they go through is much more reasoned, and therefore you have more time to deal with it. But essentially, as far as the method, okay, you assess it the exact same way and you deal with it the exact same way. My purpose, or what I'm going to teach or train the school system to do, is identify the crisis. I make sure that that person's on the pathway, avoid false positives and false negatives, right? And then have a reasonable intervention based on where they are on the pathway. But I'm still using crisis intervention because I'm stepping in as their social support, as their helper, as that person to remove that crisis. And just like in the domestic violence situation, once I become the helper and I show them a way out of this that's better, then they're going to comply because I just eliminated crisis for them and they come out because I asked them to. You move over to the active killer situation, the same thing happens. Okay. Whatever their problem is with their bully or whatever's going on, I step in and stop the crisis. And if I stop the crisis, I prevent the violence because there's no reason for them, there's no motivation to kill anymore because the crisis is gone. And if people would just realize that understanding these direct behaviors, these things that go into this, right? And don't focus on things like mental illness and the gun and all these other side issues that may or may not be there in the first place. But if they are, they may or may not be a threat enhancer. Because again, mentally ill people may not be violent. That may not be and so you have to make sure that you get to the point where it's not just connecting the dots. Okay, that's part of it. But if you don't have the right dots to connect, it doesn't matter what you connect because it's not going to work. So you have to get those right dots. And then you connect those dots and then you tie it into this methodology, this approach, which is basically, this is nothing more than hostage negotiation 101, in my opinion. I'm calling it behavioral analysis and calling it, behavioral science, whatever you want to call it, threat assessment, whatever. You're essentially using basic hostage negotiation methodology. That's what I bring forward in the book. That's the difference between my approach versus maybe other people's approach. And, so, if you're going to say, people tell me, ask me, why are you different? Why should I listen to you for threat assessment? Why should I read your book? And I'm going to say, well, first off, most of the stuff I say in there, right, is going to be pretty much just best practices that you probably already know if you're a threat assessor. What you may not have considered is, how do you know when the person is actually on the pathway? And that's the fatal grievance concept of the fatal grievance, right? And then how do you know that you're not running after or going to end up with a false negative or a false positive? False negative meaning you come to the conclusion that he's not violent and he is, or a false positive, which is the cry wolf syndrome, which is, yeah, he's going to be violent. He's going to be real, and he never is, right? And that right there for me is the Achilles heel of all this threat assessment stuff. First of all, people aren't paying attention to it because most of the time it's like, oh, well, geez, well, yeah. After every attack, it's like, oh man, we had all these indicators, but no one paid attention to them, right? Well, this is how you make sense of it, because you have a tremendous opportunity to stop this violence. But of course, you can't always, and you always have to have a plan B in the event it doesn't work.
What would be your advice to a person who's being held hostage? Because I hear a lot of times, just comply with whatever they ask you. I've also, I think, heard you say, like, don't fight the bad guy, like, don't decide to take him on. So I guess what should we be doing if we ever get held hostage?
Well, it's one of those things, if you're really being held hostage, by someone, regardless what it is, you want to be a good hostage. So you don't like, if someone wants to give you some food or water, don't turn it down. Right. Pay attention to patterns. Okay. You realize that, everybody's favorite word is their name, and everybody's favorite topic is themselves. Right. So you don't want to be a difficult person. You don't want to, you don't want to, obviously you want to stick to your, be able to say no if they're crossing a line or whatever to a certain degree, right? But you basically, being part of being a good hostage, right, is not becoming unnecessarily difficult to that person. If it's an emotional thing, like a domestic violence situation, it's a much more dangerous situation. If you are in a situation of ransom or a situation of, your correction officer being held, by a gang in a prison, the danger to you is much less because you're valuable to them, right? Above and beyond that, we always want to look at opportunities to first avoid the situation in the first place, right? Not get yourself in that situation in the first place. Know how to escape and know what that means, right? Know how to evade or hide or lock down if necessary, and then know how to engage if necessary. And so, those are the skill sets, right? Is basically, and there's an old military um, approach. It was called SEER, survival, evasion, resistance, and escape, and stuff like this. But I like to look at it from the standpoint of, targeted violence, right? Okay, you're being held hostage. You're in your classroom, in school, you're at a restaurant, and then all of a sudden you got danger. Rather you get taken hostage or not, right? You still got to have the ability to have good situational awareness, understand the situation you're in, and then look for opportunities to avoid, escape, evade, and engage at the last minute, right? If you have to. I mean, we certainly don't want to emphasize to get into a fight with the bad guy. And just to your point, when I've said that on previous podcasts and things that I've done, when I'm talking about don't engage the offender, it's typically in the environment of like a school or workplace environment. We have found out that if you have an active shooter, active killer, whatever you want to call it, in your school or workplace, you should never be expected to actually try to attack that person. What I'm talking about is in a more of a defensive engagement against them, such as you're barricaded in your room, okay, in an office, bathroom, wherever you are, and somehow he starts to enter that room and he crosses that threshold, that door threshold, the window threshold. You see a piece of him, you see a piece of his weapon, whatever. That's what you attack, and then you go through and we have a whole checklist of things to keep in mind on that.
It sounds like listening would be extremely important. Listening and paying attention to what does this person want? Because
Absolutely.
once you figure out what they want, you can kind of ascertain if you're valuable to them or not.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, that's kind of the basis of all good interviewers, all good interrogators, all good counselors, right? All good hostage negotiators, all good hostages, right? Is they have the ability to listen and assess the situation and figure out what does that other person need, and let them talk about those needs and stuff like this. And if they seem to be agitated or you hear emotions, deal with those emotions. And you seem really pissed off. What did I say? What's going on? Tell me, you seem really frustrated with what's going on. And they'll tell you. They'll tell you real quick. Even though you're hardened criminal, if he's irritated with you, he's going to give you an earful, and that's good because that's venting, and you're actually building a relationship, and he doesn't even realize it.
So we're going to put the link to your websites and your book and your LinkedIn and the like in the description of this video. Share with us a little about your new YouTube channel.
So I started. It's a little bit different than when you see me with Safe Defend or with Vecchi Group. As far as the threat assessment. I speak more in terms of organizational threat assessment, and then what employees and teachers and things can do to deal with targeted violence and things like this. The YouTube channel that I'm starting is more geared towards obtaining compliance, whatever that means to you. Right now, compliance in the physical form, right, is if you're threatened, right, is self-defense or personal protection type stuff, and but also compliance has to do with being able to to negotiate or tactically negotiate. So the bottom line is that if you're threatened or you're under attack or you're going to gain compliance, right, there's only three things you can do to gain compliance. Okay, in a threat situation. Okay, you can either talk, fight, or shoot. That's it. And so you're either going to obtain voluntary compliance through talking, which is negotiation. If you can't get that, or it's too dangerous to do that, that's not going to work, then you have to get involuntary compliance. And that's either through Physical means, and when I say by fight, I'm talking about, controlling the other person, right? Strikes, dealing with knives and other, type of weapons and sticks and things like this. And then there's a deadly force compliance, which is with the firearm, if, for those that carry concealed and things like this. And so there may be people that don't care about the gun stuff, and that's okay. They don't have to watch those videos, they don't have to, right? But for me, it's kind of one of those things where, compliance can happen. And it really depends on the degree of threat that you are being presented with, right? If at all possible, we want to talk our way out of it. We want to avoid it, get away from it. And that's part of situational awareness and avoidance, right? If that doesn't work, then we're going to try to escape the problem, right? And if which means, just you see the guy with the rifle, we go that way, right, and leave, right? Okay, or we evade that person. Might be a lockdown, might be things like this. And then there's the engage piece, and the engage piece is kind of what this compliance things is kind of focused on. It's what to do, personal protection if you are presented with, a physical threat or some sort of, emotional threat, and then, how do you get compliance? How do you get them to stop the action? And again, it comes back to it's very simple. It's a very simple concept: talk, fight, or shoot, and then you're moving, right? So you're either moving from talk to fight or back to fight to talk, right? Or you go from talk and somebody pulls a gun out, you go to shoot, right? It's all about personal protection. But here's the deal. The reason I call it the tactical academic is because it's meant for the everyday person. It's not meant for the police. This is not meant for some special ops people. It's meant for people who may have disabilities. Okay. It's meant for people who are normal. It's meant for males, females. It's meant for juveniles. It's meant for, whoever needs that. And it's also addressed from the standpoint that you're going to be by yourself, and it's probably going to be an ambush type of an attack. And so it goes back into understanding that offender and their behavior, same thing as I always talk about. And then also human physiology, because when you're scared, when you experience a threat, your sympathetic nervous system kicks over, and you're going to be in that fight or flight or freeze syndrome, right? The body alarm response. And it's got to work in that. So part of that is an understanding of that state that you get into, and then how can you work through that, and overcome that enough, or work with that, or work within that, to be successful. And that's understanding the human physiology, understanding the offender, and then understanding your options, and then your own attributes, and what really is realistic for you. And then also and then making the assumption that you're on your own, and you got to deal with the situation yourself. You're not a police officer. You're not highly skilled. You're not an athlete. You don't have to have any of that. So this is kind of, compliance. I call it tactical conflict resolution. That's the word title I gave it. And tactical conflict resolution is talk, fight, shoot, and move. And your engagement zone is talk, fight, shoot, and your disengagement zone is the move zone. And there are both verbal and nonverbal components to it. So that's pretty much in a nutshell what it is.
That sounds like really valuable information. So that's Tactical Academic on YouTube.
Yep.
Dr. Vecchi, thank you so much for your time today. I am very, very appreciative of you taking the time to talk to us and educate us about these things that are so important in society now.
Well, I appreciate the opportunity for inviting me. It's always great to interact with you as usual. And I'm happy to continue working with you as much as you need.
Okay, I'd like to have you back to talk about another topic in the future. So maybe we can do that at some point in time.
I would love that.
Take care.
All right. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.